I shouldn't have come here. That's the first thought that screams in my head every time I watch this back. My breath catches even now, just seeing the flickering light from my headlamp cut through the absolute blackness. It was supposed to be a simple urban exploration, another forgotten building to document for the channel. Just a few hours, in and out. But the moment I stepped over that crumbling threshold, the air changed. It wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, like the weight of decades of despair, and something else, something far more sinister, was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just nerves, the usual thrill of the unknown. But then I heard it. A whisper, just at the edge of hearing, echoing from deeper within the decaying walls. And that's when I knew this wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting for me. My headlamp beam danced erratically as I froze, every muscle tensed. I strained my ears, holding my breath until my lungs ached, but the sound was gone. Just the deafening silence of decay, punctuated only by the frantic thump of my own heart against my ribs. It had to be my imagination, the wind whistling through a broken pane, settling dust, the creaks and groans of a century-old structure finally giving up the ghost. That's all it was. That's what I told myself, trying to force a rational explanation onto the cold dread that was already coiling in my gut. But the air still felt thick, heavy, like breathing in wet wool. And that sense of being watched, it wasn't just nerves anymore. It felt palpable, like unseen eyes boring holes into the back of my skull. I gripped my camera tighter, the plastic cold and slick with the sweat on my palm. My breath hitched again as I forced myself to move forward, one hesitant step at a time. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to take on monstrous forms in the periphery of my vision. The dust motes, illuminated by my headlamp, swirled like tiny malevolent spirits in the stagnant air. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each creak echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I kept telling myself, just keep filming, get the shot, get out. But my focus was splintered, half on the lens, half on the oppressive darkness around me, straining for another sound, another sign. Then I saw it. Tucked away in a recessed alcove, half obscured by years of grime and fallen plaster, was a small, crudely carved symbol. It wasn't graffiti, it wasn't a gang tag. It was something else entirely. A jagged, almost organic shape, like a twisted skeletal hand reaching out, or perhaps a deformed animal claw. It was etched deeply into the concrete, not just drawn on, and around it, faint but undeniable, were dark, dried stains. My headlamp beam lingered, highlighting the disturbing detail. My mind screamed for it to be rust or old paint, but a primal part of me knew better. It looked like dried blood. My stomach lurched, threatening to betray me. A cold spot hit me then, not just the general chill of the building, but a distinct pocket of Arctic air that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was right behind me. I spun around, camera still rolling, sweeping the beam through the emptiness. Nothing, just the endless, suffocating black. But the cold lingered, clinging to my back like an invisible presence. My breathing grew shallower, ragged. This wasn't a forgotten building. This was a grave, or something worse. The whisper returned then, clearer this time, a dry, raspy sound, like leaves skittering across pavement. But it wasn't wind, it was a voice. It wasn't speaking words I understood, but the intent was unmistakable. It was a warning, or an invitation. And it was coming from deeper inside, from the very heart of the building's decaying darkness. My heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I should have turned back. I should have run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something compelled me forward, a morbid curiosity battling with pure, unadulterated terror. I had to know what was waiting for me. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it knew I was coming. The compulsion was a physical pull, a cold hand on my spine guiding me deeper. Each step was a battle, my legs heavy, my mind screaming to turn and run, but my body refused. The air grew thicker, tasting of dust and something metallic, like old blood, or perhaps just the rusted decay of the building itself. My headlamp beam, once a comfort, now felt like a spotlight, announcing my presence, illuminating the path for whatever was waiting. The walls seemed to press in, the ceiling lower, even though I knew logically it was just the perception of the deepening darkness. My breath hitched with every creak, every groan of the ancient structure, each sound amplified, distorted into something menacing. The faint whisper returned then, not just a single voice this time, but a chorus, a dry, rustling symphony of barely perceptible sounds that seemed to weave in and out of each other, forming no coherent words, yet carrying an undeniable weight of malice. It was all around me now, a palpable hum of unseen activity. My skin crawled. I felt like I was walking into a spider's web, blindly, knowing I was already caught. My camera felt heavier, a useless shield against the encroaching dread. I kept it pointed forward, a desperate attempt to capture proof, to make sense of the madness. I rounded a corner, the beam cutting through what looked like a collapsed doorway, revealing a smaller, enclosed room. The air here was even colder, a freezing pocket that made my teeth ache. And then I saw it. Directly in the center of the room, illuminated starkly by my light, was a chair. An old wooden chair, the kind you'd find in a dusty attic. But it wasn't the chair itself that made my blood run cold. It was what was on it, or rather, what was arranged on it. A collection of items carefully placed. A child's worn porcelain doll, its eyes gouged out, replaced by two small, dark, irregular stones. Beside it, a rusted, jagged shard of metal, perhaps from a broken pipe. And draped over the armrest, a single, dried flower, its petals crumbling into dust at the slightest vibration. But the most disturbing element was the floor around the chair. It wasn't just dusty. There were faint but distinct drag marks leading from a dark corner towards the chair, as if something had been pulled across the floor, leaving shallow trails in the grime. And in the very center of those marks, directly beneath the chair, was another symbol. This one was larger, etched with more force, almost gouged into the concrete. It was the same twisted, skeletal claw I'd seen before, but this time it was surrounded by smaller, intricate lines, like veins or roots spreading outward. My heart was no longer just hammering. It was a frantic, desperate bird trapped in my chest, trying to beat its way out. This wasn't just an abandoned building. This was a shrine, a place of ritual. The whisper intensified, coalescing into a single dry breath right at my ear. It wasn't speaking, it was breathing on me. I could feel the cold vapor against my neck. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to bolt, to drop the camera and run for my life. But I was frozen, my feet rooted to the spot, my eyes fixated on the grotesque tableau before me. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the doll's head tilted. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. The empty stone eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I could feel its gaze. I was no longer alone in that room. My blood ran to ice. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. The porcelain doll, its head gouged and filled with those dead stones, had moved. Slowly, deliberately, its vacant stare pivoted, tracking me. My breath hitched, a strangled sound caught in my throat. The cold vapor at my ear intensified, wrapping around my head like an icy shroud. I could feel the individual hairs on my neck stand on end, a phantom touch brushing against my skin, sending shivers like electric currents down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and flee, but my feet were cemented to the concrete, my muscles locked in a terrifying stasis. I was a deer in headlights, utterly paralyzed, watching the very thing of nightmares come to life. The stone eyes of the doll, devoid of any warmth or light, felt like they were drilling into my very soul, seeing not just me, but every fear, every desperate thought. I could hear the frantic thump of my heart, a cannonade in my chest, threatening to burst through my ribs. The raspy breath at my ear wasn't just breathing anymore. It felt like a presence, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against me, leaning in. And then a sound. Not a whisper, not a rustle, but a low, guttural growl emanating from behind me, so close I could feel the vibrations against my skull. It wasn't human. It was ancient, predatory, and filled with an unspeakable hunger. My eyes darted, tearing themselves from the doll's unholy gaze, sweeping the beam of my headlamp frantically around the small, cramped room. Nothing, just shadows clinging to the corners, mocking my terror. But the growl was real. The sensation of a massive, unseen entity looming directly behind me was utterly, terrifyingly real. My fingers, still clenched around the camera, were numb, white. I tried to lift it, to point it behind me, to see, to capture, to prove what was happening, but my arm wouldn't obey. It felt like an immense pressure was holding me in place, an invisible hand clamped firmly on my shoulder. The air grew even colder, so cold it burned my lungs with every shallow, desperate gasp. A sickly sweet smell, like decay mixed with something metallic, filled my nostrils, making my stomach churn. I felt lightheaded, dizzy, on the verge of collapse. And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the doll's head tilted further, its empty eyes now looking past me towards the darkened doorway I had just entered. A new sound joined the growl, a soft, slithering scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, coming from outside the room, from the hallway I'd just traversed. The drag marks on the floor around the chair suddenly made horrific sense. This wasn't just a shrine, it was a trap, and I was the bait, or the offering. A whimper escaped my lips, barely audible even to myself. Whimper. The fear was no longer just a cold dread. It was a living, breathing thing, consuming me from the inside out. My vision blurred at the edges, my body trembling uncontrollably. I could feel the unseen presence behind me shift, its icy grip tightening on my mind. It wanted me to look. It wanted me to see. It wanted me to turn around and face whatever unspeakable horror was waiting. But I couldn't. I was too terrified. My eyes were glued to the doorway, to the approaching sound, knowing that whatever was coming was being drawn in by my presence, by the entity behind me. This was it. This was the end. I was caught. And I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever was about to happen, the camera would bear witness to it all. The slithering sound intensified, no longer just a scrape, but a wet, heavy drag, accompanied by a sickening squelch. It was just beyond the doorway now, obscured by the last remaining sliver of shadow. My headlamp beam, still fixed forward by my paralyzed grip, illuminated only the edge of the opening, painting the dust motes dancing in the air like frantic, tiny specters. I could hear something now, a ragged, wet exhalation that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. It was huge. I could tell by the sheer volume of sound, the way the ancient floorboards groaned under its unseen weight, not just in one spot, but continuously, as if a massive, shapeless mass was slowly oozing its way forward. The stench of decay and metal sharpened, burning my nostrils, making my eyes water. It was the smell of a charnel house, of something long dead but refusing to lie still. The growl behind me escalated, a low, rumbling vibration that shook my very bones, resonating deep in my chest. It felt like a challenge, a territorial roar, directed not at me, but at the thing approaching the doorway. I was caught between them, a fragile, terrified bridge. The pressure on my mind intensified, a cold, sharp spike of dread driving deeper into my skull, urging me to turn, to witness the horror that lurked just inches from my back. But I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the doorway, on the creeping shadow that was beginning to fill the opening. A shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, seeped into the frame of the collapsed doorway. It wasn't a distinct shape at first, more like a distortion of the air itself, a void that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Then, a glistening, chitinous surface caught my headlamp, a wet, segmented curve that seemed to ripple with an unnatural internal light. It was moving slowly, deliberately, forcing its way through the narrow opening. The squelching sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking, like many tiny claws or mandibles skittering together. My stomach rebelled, a wave of nausea washing over me so powerful I thought I would vomit. My throat was dry, constricted, every breath a painful, ragged gasp. The doll's head, still tilted, seemed to track the approaching horror with its vacant stone eyes, a silent, macabre sentinel. The entity behind me let out another, deeper growl, a sound of pure, ancient malevolence that vibrated through the floor and up through my feet. I could feel its presence pressing even closer, a suffocating weight against my back, its icy breath now a constant, freezing mist swirling around my head. I was being held, pinned in place, a sacrifice. Then, a part of the approaching horror fully entered the room. It wasn't a limb, not a head, but a mass. A glistening, obsidian mass covered in what looked like countless, tangled tendrils, each one twitching independently. It was amorphous, shifting, yet undeniably solid, pushing itself through the opening with grotesque determination. The air in the room became impossibly cold, colder than anything I had ever experienced, a bone-chilling vacuum that stole the heat from my very core. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, my entire body convulsing with a violent tremor. The tendrils, wet and black, began to unfurl, reaching out, snaking across the grimy floor towards the chair, towards the doll, towards me. They moved with an unsettling speed, far faster than their slow, ponderous entry suggested. And then, the growl behind me became a roar, a deafening explosion of sound that ripped through the air, shattering the oppressive silence. The pressure on my back released for a split second, a sudden, terrifying absence, as if the entity behind me had recoiled, or perhaps lunged. My body, momentarily freed from its unseen grip, reacted with a desperate, primal urge to flee. I tried to turn, to run, to scream, but it was too late. One of the tendrils, thick as a man's arm, lashed out, wrapping around my ankle with impossible speed. It was cold, slimy, and incredibly strong. I felt a searing pain as it tightened, digging into my flesh. My camera, still clutched in my hand, swung wildly, its beam momentarily flashing across the glistening, pulsating mass that was now fully in the room, revealing glimpses of more tendrils, more chitinous plates, and something else, something utterly indescribable, a gaping maw of darkness within its shifting form. Then, another tendril, even thicker, shot out and wrapped around my waist, lifting me effortlessly from the ground.
My headlamp beam, now pointing erratically, spun across the ceiling, then the floor, then the doll, its stone eyes still fixed on the horror that had ensnared me. I was suspended in the air, dangling, helpless. The growl behind me was now a furious, echoing snarl, and I felt a hot, sickening breath on the back of my neck, accompanied by a sharp, piercing pain, like a needle-sharp claw digging into my skin. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound torn from the deepest part of my being. The tendril around my ankle tightened, squeezing, crushing. I heard a sickening snap, felt a blinding flash of agony shoot up my leg. My grip on the camera faltered, my fingers going completely numb. It slipped from my grasp, falling, bouncing once on the concrete floor with a sickening thud. Its lens still pointed upwards, towards me, towards the things that held me. The last thing it captured was my terrified, contorted face, illuminated by its own failing beam, as the tendrils pulled me deeper into the pulsing, inky mass, and the darkness behind me closed in. The growling and the squelching became one deafening, all-consuming sound. Then, black, just black, and a final, distorted shriek, not mine, but something ancient, triumphant, and utterly horrifying. The screen went black. That's where the footage always ends. That's where my footage ends.
For a long time, I wished it was the end for me too, but it wasn't. Not really. I don't know how long I was in that darkness, in that thing. Time ceased to exist. All I remember is the cold, the pressure, and the whispers. Not the dry, rustling whispers from before, but new ones. In my head, always in my head now. They found me, eventually. Days later, they said, miles from the building. I was barely alive, delirious. They called it hypothermia, shock. They called it a breakdown. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel what I felt. The doctors asked me questions, gentle questions at first, then sharper, more insistent ones. They didn't understand when I told them about the tendrils, about the growl, about the doll's eyes. They just saw a trauma victim. But I know the truth. I survived, yes, but I didn't escape. Not really. The cold never truly leaves me now. It's in my bones, in my blood. And the whispers, they're constant, a low hum beneath the surface of every sound, every thought. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch a faint, metallic scent, and I see things in the periphery, shadows that move just out of sight, eyes that flicker in the darkness of my own home. I feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, just like I did in that abandoned place. It's still watching. It's still here. Or maybe I am still there. A part of me, anyway. I keep watching this footage over and over, trying to find answers, trying to understand what happened to me. What is happening to me? It's the only proof I have that I'm not completely insane. It's a warning, a testament. So I ask you, if you've ever felt that chill that goes beyond the weather, if you've ever seen a shadow linger too long or heard a whisper that wasn't there, tell me I'm not alone in this. Have you ever visited an abandoned place and felt like something followed you home? Because I think it did. I know it did. And I don't think it's ever going to leave.